A silver locket hides more than dark magic. It holds the echo of a forbidden confession. Is it a key to salvation, or a noose for those seeking light in the frozen silence of the past? We begin our story now. The silence of the Hogwarts library at midnight was not empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums, thick with the scent of dust, curing parchment, and the lingering metallic tang of ancient magic. For Hermione Granger, this silence was usually a sanctuary, a fortress of logic where the chaotic trauma of the war couldn't breach the walls. But tonight, the silence felt predatory. The 8th year had been a strange, disjointed experience. The castle had been rebuilt, stone by stone, magic fusing the cracks. But the scars remained if one knew where to look. They were in the uneven mortar of the West Tower. They were in the way the students flinched at loud noises. They were in the hollow, haunted eyes of the returnees who were trying to pretend they were still children. Hermione sat in a secluded alcove deep within the restricted section, a pile of arithmancy charts abandoned in front of her. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the shelves that seemed to stretch infinitely upwards into the gloom. She wasn't studying. She hadn't been studying for an hour. She was staring at the object sitting innocent and malevolent on the table. She had found it tucked behind a rotting volume of Curses of the Old Blood, a book that hadn't been checked out in 50 years. It was a small octagonal box made of black wood that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Inside lay a silver locket. It wasn't the delicate filigreed silver of elven make. It was heavy, industrial, tarnished to a dull grey. But it was the feeling of it that made Hermione's breath catch in her throat. Even without touching it, she could feel a low, vibrating hum emanating from the metal. It was a cold sensation, like a draught from a crypt, sliding over her skin and raising goose flesh on her arms. It tasted of ozone and bitterness. It was dark art. There was no mistaking the specific, oily resonance of magic that was designed to coerce or harm. With trembling fingers, she had levitated it out of the box earlier, turning it over in the air. And there, scratched crudely into the back of the heavy silver casing, were 2 letters, D.M. The initials seemed to burn into her retinas. D.M. Her mind, sharpened by years of vigilance and the adrenaline of survival, made the connection instantly. There was no hesitation, no benefit of the doubt. The war had burned that luxury out of her. Draco Malfoy. The name brought a visceral reaction. Her left forearm prickled, the phantom pain of a scar that would never fade. She closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. Malfoy had returned to Hogwarts by court order, a part of his probation. He was a ghost in the corridors, a pale spectre gliding between classes, speaking to no one, his head bowed. The faculty whispered about his rehabilitation. The students whispered about his crimes. Hermione had tried to ignore him. She had tried to be the bigger person, to focus on her NEWTS and the future. But finding this concentrated piece of darkness with his initials carved into it like a claim of ownership. "He hasn't changed," she whispered to the empty aisle. The sound of her own voice startled her. "He's just hiding." Anger, hot and righteous, began to displace the fear. If Draco Malfoy was smuggling dark artifacts into the school, if he was practicing or communicating with remaining sympathizers, he was a danger to everyone. He was a danger to the fragile peace they had bled to build. A floorboard creaked. The sound was distant, coming from the main atrium of the library, but in the oppressive quiet, it sounded like a gunshot. Hermione instinctively doused her candle with a sharp flick of her wand. Darkness swallowed her alcove, save for the faint, silvery moonlight filtering through the high, arched windows. She held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She grabbed the black box, shoving the locket inside and slipping it into the deep pocket of her robes. She moved, not with the heavy step of a student, but with the silent, stalking grace of a soldier. She pressed herself against the end of the bookshelf, peering out into the central aisle. There was a figure standing near the restricted section gate. The moonlight caught the distinctive white-blonde hair, turning it into a halo of cold silver. It was him. Draco Malfoy stood motionless in the center of the aisle. He wasn't wearing his school robes. He was dressed in a black turtleneck and trousers, a silhouette cut from the shadows themselves. He looked thinner than she remembered, his sharp features carved from marble, harsh and angular. The arrogance that had once defined his posture was gone, replaced by a rigid, brittle tension. He looked like a wire pulled so tight it was seconds away from snapping. He was looking for something. Hermione watched, her hand tightening around her wand in her pocket. She saw his grey eyes scanning the shelves, desperate and darting. He wasn't browsing. He was hunting. His hands were clenched at his sides, the fingers twitching in a nervous rhythm. He took a step towards the section she had just vacated. Hermione's pulse roared in her ears. He's looking for the locket, she thought, panic and vindication warring in her chest. He came back for it. She shrank back into the shadows, casting a non-verbal disillusionment charm over herself. The magic washed over her like a cool egg, rendering her nearly invisible against the dark wood of the shelves. Malfoy moved closer. He passed within 3 feet of her. She could smell him. Not the expensive cologne he used to drown in, but the scent of rain, old parchment, and something sharp, like mint and fear. He stopped at the exact shelf where she had found the box. Hermione held her breath, her lungs burning. She watched the profile of his face. He looked exhausted. Dark, bruised circles lay beneath his eyes, standing out starkly against his pallid skin. His lips were parted slightly, and she could hear his breathing, shallow, ragged breaths that hitched in his chest. He reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering over the gap between the books where the box had been. When his fingers met only empty air and dust, he froze. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Draco didn't curse or storm. He simply collapsed inward. His hand dropped, and he leaned his forehead against the spine of a book, his eyes squeezing shut. A sound escaped him, a low, strangled noise that was half groan, half sob. It was the sound of someone who had reached the end of their endurance. "No," he whispered. The word was barely a breath. "No, no, please." Hermione felt a jolt of confusion. This wasn't the reaction of a dark wizard missing his weapon. This sounded like desperation, panic. He spun around, his eyes wild, scanning the darkness. For a terrifying second, his gaze seemed to bore right through her disillusionment charm. She saw the raw terror in his mercury eyes, a vulnerability so profound it felt like an intrusion to witness it. He looked like a trapped animal knowing the cage was closing. Then the mask slammed back into place. In the blink of an eye, the despair vanished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable blankness. He straightened his spine, smoothing his jumper, locking the fear away behind high mental walls. He turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps rapid and silent, fleeing the scene of his loss. Hermione remained frozen until the library door clicked shut far in the distance. She let the charm fade, leaning back against the bookshelf, her legs suddenly weak. She pulled the black box from her pocket, her thumb tracing the sharp edges. The narrative in her head had been simple. Malfoy was evil. Malfoy had a dark object. Malfoy needed to be stopped. But the sound of his voice, that broken, pleading whisper, lingered in her ears. It didn't fit. It grated against her assumptions like sand in a gear. Why was he so terrified? Was the locket dangerous to him? Or was he afraid of who would find it? She looked down at the box. The locket inside hummed, a low, nasty vibration that travelled up her arm and settled in her chest. "Property of DM," she murmured, the suspicion hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. She couldn't go to the headmistress. Not yet. If she turned it in and it was his, he would be expelled, or sent to Azkaban. Despite everything, despite the years of torment and the mark on her arm, the thought of sending him to the Dementors made her stomach churn. She needed proof. She needed to know what this object did and why he was so desperate to hide it. She needed to understand the monster before she exposed him. Hermione shoved the box deep into her bag and cast a locking charm on the clasp. She gathered her books, blowing out the scent of extinguished candle wax. The game had changed. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a watcher. And Draco Malfoy, whether he knew it or not, was now her target. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain lashed against the high windows of the library, blurring the world into streaks of grey and black, mirroring the storm that had just begun inside her. The following week was a study in controlled obsession. Hermione found herself categorizing her life not by her revision timetable, but by the movements of Draco Malfoy. She became a cartographer of his misery, mapping the precise moments he appeared in the Great Hall. Always late, always picking at a plate of green apples or dry toast. And the exact second he vanished into the bowels of the castle after the final bell. The locket remained in her bag, a cold weight that seemed to pulse against her hip with every step. It was a secret that hummed. Occasionally, during a particularly dull transfiguration lecture, she would feel the vibration intensify, a rhythmic thrumming that mimicked a heartbeat. It was unsettlingly organic. It felt as though the object was reaching out, searching for its twin, or perhaps searching for the very person who had carved those jagged initials into its skin. She watched him from across the library, hidden behind a fortress of ancient runes texts. Draco was a master of stillness. He could sit for 3 hours with a single parchment in front of him, his quill poised but never moving. He looked like a statue of a fallen prince, elegant and decaying. But Hermione saw the micro-movements, the way his jaw tightened when a group of Gryffindors laughed too loudly, the way his eyes constantly flicked toward the entrance, and the way he touched his left forearm through the thick wool of his sleeve, a habitual gesture of phantom pain. "He knows," she whispered to herself, scribbling nonsense in the margins of her notes. "He knows it's gone, and he's waiting for the blow to fall." But the blow didn't come. Hermione didn't go to McGonagall. She didn't go to Harry. She told herself it was because she needed more evidence. because the DM could technically stand for anything. Doris Mayfield, Desmond Mallow. But deep down, in the quiet, honest parts of her soul she didn't like to visit, she knew it was the look on his face in the restricted section that stopped her. That raw, hollowed-out despair. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything and was now losing the memory of it, too. On Thursday, the atmosphere shifted. The late October air had turned brutal, bringing a biting frost that clawed at the castle windows. Hermione followed him after dinner. He didn't head toward the Slytherin dungeons. Instead, he climbed. He moved with a frantic, agitated energy she hadn't seen before. Up the shifting staircases, past the corridor of weeping portraits, higher and higher, until the air grew thin and smelled of wet stone and owl droppings. He was heading for the owlery. Hermione cast a notice-me-not charm, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stayed half a flight of stairs behind him, her boots clicking softly on the stone. Inside the owlery, the air was a whirlwind of feathers and the soft, haunting hoots of sleeping birds. Draco stood by the open ledge, the wind whipping his white blonde hair into a frenzy. He wasn't sending a letter. He was just standing there, staring out into the black void of the Highlands, his hands gripping the stone sill so hard his knuckles were skeletal. "Where is it?" he hissed into the wind. It wasn't a question. It was a prayer. "Where did you put it, you little thief?" Hermione froze in the doorway. He knew. He didn't know who, but he knew he was being watched. "I know you're there," Draco said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky register. He didn't turn around. "I've felt you following me for days. Your concealment charms are proficient, Granger, but your scent is unmistakable. Ink, old paper, and that Merlin awful vanilla soap." The charm shattered. Hermione stepped out of the shadows, her chin lifted, her hand already on the box in her pocket. "I'm not a thief, Malfoy. I'm a witness." He turned then. The moonlight was unkind to him, sharpening the hollows of his cheeks and making his eyes look like two silver coins. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "A witness to what? My slow descent into madness, my riveting schedule of breathing and existing." He took a step toward her, his stature imposing even in his diminished state. "Give it back." "The locket?" Hermione pulled the box out, holding it between them like a shield. "The one with your initials? The one that reeks of the kind of magic that gets people life sentences in Azkaban?" Draco's eyes fixed on the box. A spasm of something, fear, or perhaps a strange kind of relief, crossed his face. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "You don't understand what you're holding. You think you're being the hero, don't you? Protecting the school from the big, bad Death Eater." "I think I'm protecting the peace," she countered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Why does it vibrate, Draco? Why does it feel like it's trying to eat the light in the room?" "Because it's a soul anchor," he spat, the words tasting like poison. "But not the kind you think. It's not a Horcrux, if that's what your overactive brain has deduced. It's a tether. And if you keep it near you, it will start to bleed into you. It will show you things you aren't strong enough to see." "Then why do you have it?" she challenged, stepping closer. The tension between them was a physical thing, a taut cord vibrating at a frequency only they could hear. "Why were you hiding it in the restricted section?" Draco laughed, a dry, hacking sound that had no mirth in it. "I wasn't hiding it, you insufferable girl. I was trying to destroy it." Do you have any idea how hard it is to break a black family heirloom? It feeds on intent. It feeds on the very magic used against it. He took another step. He was so close now she could see the pulse jumping in his neck. The smell of him, rain and mint, swirled around her, mixing with the cold owlery air. "Give it to me, Hermione," he said. It was the first time he had ever used her name. The sound of it, spoken in that low, broken drawl, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the frost. "Before it finishes what the war started." "No," she said, though her resolve was flickering. "If it's as dangerous as you say, I'm taking it to McGonagall. We'll destroy it properly." Draco's face went deadly pale. He lunged forward, not to strike her, but to grab the box. Hermione instinctively ducked, her hand flying to her wand, but he was faster. He caught her wrist, his skin searingly hot against her cold flesh. The moment his fingers clamped onto her arm, the box between them began to howl. A soundless scream tore through the air, a psychic shockwave that threw them both backward. Hermione hit the stone wall with a thud, the breath leaving her lungs in a gasp. The box fell, skittering across the floor, the lid popping open. The silver locket rolled out, glowing with a sickly violet light. It didn't just vibrate now, it pulsed. A thick, oily smoke began to curl out from the seam of the metal, forming shapes in the air. Shattered faces, broken wands, the silhouette of a dark mark. Draco was on his knees, clutching his head. "Don't look at it," he choked out. "Hermione, look at me." But she couldn't. She was staring at the smoke. She saw herself, but not as she was. She saw herself carved open on the floor of Malfoy Manor. She heard Bellatrix's laughter. She felt the knife. The locket was amplifying her trauma, feeding it back to her, turning her memories into a weapon. "It's not real," a voice hissed in her ear. Suddenly, a weight pressed against her. Draco had crawled to her, throwing his body over hers, shielding her eyes with his hand. He was shaking violently, his chest heaving against her shoulder. "Close your eyes," he gasped, his breath hot against her temple. "Think of something else, anything else. Don't let it in." The proximity was startling. He was solid, warm, and desperate. His heart was hammering against her back, a frantic human rhythm that drowned out the locket's cursed pulse. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the feeling of his wool sweater against her cheek and the scent of mint. He reached out with his free hand, fumbling for his wand. "Expulso!" The spell hit the locket, but instead of shattering, the artifact absorbed the light, the violet glow turning into a dull, angry red. The smoke retracted, sucking back into the silver casing with a wet, slurping sound. The owlery fell silent, save for the whistling wind and their jagged breathing. Draco didn't move. He stayed draped over her, his hands still covering her eyes, his forehead resting on her shoulder. Is it over?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," he breathed. He pulled back slowly, his hands sliding down her face, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her jaw before he tore them away. He stood up, swaying on his feet. He looked down at the locket, which lay inert and grey on the floor. "That," he said, his voice ragged, "is why I was in the library. It's not my property, Granger. It belongs to my mother's side of the family. It's a grief eater. It was meant to help widows mourn, but over centuries it curdled. My father sent it to me, a reminder of my failures." Hermione sat up, rubbing her sore head. She looked at the initials. DM. DM. she said softly. Druella Black, your grandmother. Draco nodded curtly. She died with it around her neck. It's been half mad ever since. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the wall between them wasn't made of hate or prejudice. It was made of shared terror. You thought it was me, he said, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. You thought I was building a dark empire in the stacks of the library. I had reason to, she snapped, though the fire was gone from her voice. She looked at the locket, then back at him. It's getting stronger, isn't it? Every time you try to fight it. It feeds on resistance, Draco said, looking away at the dark horizon. And I have nothing left to fight it with. Hermione stood up, brushing the owl feathers from her robes. She picked up the locket. It was cold again, dead. But she knew it was just sleeping. We're going to destroy it, she said firmly. Together. Draco turned to her, his expression unreadable. Why? You could just leave me to rot with it. It's what I deserve. Maybe, Hermione said, stepping closer to him, her eyes burning with a sudden fierce light. But I'm tired of people getting what they deserve, Malfoy. I'd rather we get what we need. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of the library or the silence of the war. It was the silence of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing that the only way to survive was to hold on to the person they were supposed to hate. Meet me tomorrow, Draco said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Midnight, the room of requirement. If we're going to do this, we need to be away from the others. I'll be there, she promised. As he walked away into the dark, Hermione realized with a jolt of fear that she wasn't just following a suspect anymore. She was following a man, and she wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. The room of requirement had manifested as a low-ceilinged study, smelling of sandalwood and ancient damp stone. It was a space designed for focus, lit only by a cluster of thick, dripping candles that cast a warm amber glow over a heavy oak table. There were no windows here, no distractions from the outside world, and no escape from the presence of the other person. Hermione arrived first. She had spent the last 24 hours in a state of vibrating unrest. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom heat of Draco's hand against her face in the owlery. It was a sensory ghost that she couldn't banish with logic. She paced the length of the room, the locket sitting in the center of the table like a dormant viper. When the door creaked open, she didn't turn around immediately. She waited until she heard the soft, rhythmic click of his boots. "You're late," she said, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. "I had to avoid Filch and his wretched cat," Draco replied. His voice was closer than she expected. He had approached with a silent, predatory grace that seemed to be his only inheritance left. When she finally turned, she saw that he had shed his outer robes. He stood in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the pale, corded muscle of his forearms. On the left one, the dark mark was a blurred grey smudge, partially hidden by the way he held himself, but its presence felt like a third person in the room. "Have you found anything in your precious books?" he asked, nodding toward the stack of volumes she had brought. "The locket is a parasitic conduit," Hermione said, leaning against the table, trying to maintain a professional distance. "It's not just a grief eater. It's a focus for localized legitimacy. It finds the strongest emotional resonance in its vicinity, usually grief or guilt, and creates a feedback loop. To destroy it, we can't just use force. Force is energy, and it eats energy. Draco moved toward the table, his eyes fixed on the silver object. So, what? We ask it nicely to stop being a cursed relic of the House of Black. We have to neutralize the resonance, she explained, her fingers tracing the edge of a book. It needs a counter-vibration. If it feeds on pain and isolation, we have to provide something else, a shared intent, a stabilization of the magical field between us. Draco let out a sharp, mocking breath. Shared intent? You and me? Granger, we can't even agree on the time of day without an argument. We both want it gone, she snapped, her eyes flashing. That is shared intent. Or are you too busy wallowing in your own misery to see that I'm trying to help you? The air in the room suddenly felt charged. Draco stepped into her personal space, his height forcing her to look up. The candlelight caught the silver in his eyes, making them look like molten metal. The seesaw of their relationship swung violently toward repulsion. "Help me," he hissed, his voice dropping into that dangerous velvety register. "You don't want to help me. You want to study me. You want to dissect the fallen Malfoy and see how the gears work so you can write a nice little report for your memoirs. You want the moral high ground, as always." That's not true, isn't it? You found a dark object and your first thought wasn't, someone is in trouble. It was, Malfoy is a criminal. You spent a week stalking me like a common thief. Because you were acting like one, Hermione cried, her heart racing. You were sneaking around, looking broken and guilty. I look broken because I am broken, Draco shouted, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He slammed his hand onto the table, centimeters from the locket. I am a pariah in my own world and a ghost in yours. My parents are rotting in a manner that feels like a tomb, and I am here, in a school full of people who wish I had died on the floor of that bathroom in 6th year. So forgive me if I don't look particularly festive. The silence that followed was deafening. Hermione's breath hitched. The anger in him was so raw, so jagged, that it felt like it was cutting through her own defenses. This was the internal monologue he had been keeping behind his occlumency walls, finally spilling out in a torrent of bitterness. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The way his chest was heaving, the way his hair was disheveled, the way his lip trembled just the slightest bit. He wasn't the arrogant boy from the train anymore. He was a man who had seen the end of the world and was now being asked to live in the ruins. I don't wish you were dead, Draco, she said softly. The use of his first name acted like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes searching hers for a lie he couldn't find. The tension shifted again. The repulsion faded, replaced by an agonizing magnetic pull. Don't, he whispered. Don't be kind to me. I don't know what to do with it. We have to do this, she said, ignoring his protest and stepping even closer. She reached out, her hand hovering over the locket. Together. We have to hold it, Draco. Both of us. If we channel our magic through it simultaneously, we can create a harmonic surge that will shatter the enchantment. But we have to be synchronized. Draco looked at her hand, then at her face. The doubt was thick in his expression, a betrayal of his own instincts. If we aren't synchronized, it will tear our minds apart, It will show us each other's worst moments." "I'm willing to risk it," Hermione said, her voice filled with a bravery she didn't quite feel. "Are you?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. He reached out, his long fingers trembling as they moved toward the silver. "On 3, he said. 1. They both took a breath. 2. The candlelight seemed to dim, the shadows stretching toward them. 3. Their hands closed over the locket at the same time. The explosion wasn't physical, but mental. White light scorched Hermione's vision. She felt a sickening jolt in her stomach, like falling from a great height. Suddenly, she wasn't in the room of requirement. She was in a cold, dark hallway. She felt a crushing weight of expectation on her shoulders. She felt the cold sting of a father's disappointment. She felt the searing, white-hot agony of the Cruciatus curse. But it wasn't her pain. It was his. She saw a younger Draco kneeling before a hooded figure, his face slick with tears and sweat. She felt his soul-deep terror as he was forced to choose between becoming a murderer or watching his mother die. "Stop," she thought, her mind screaming. "It's too much." At the same time, Draco was being pulled into her. He felt the suffocating loneliness of being the brightest witch of her age, with no one to truly understand the pressure. He felt the jagged, cold blade of Bellatrix's knife carving into her arm. He felt the absolute, unwavering love she had for her friends, a love so bright it blinded him. They were drowning in each other. Their boundaries were dissolving. "Draco!" she screamed, though her mouth didn't move. The locket between them began to glow with a blinding, iridescent light. It hummed a high, piercing note that threatened to shatter their teeth. In the real world, their bodies were locked together, their fingers entwined over the metal. Draco's eyes were blown wide, staring into hers. He saw her pain, and she saw his guilt. Suddenly, the locket let out a final, violent pulse. They were thrown apart, both hitting the floor on opposite sides of the room. The locket lay in the center of the table, now split down the middle, the silver blackened and dead. The DM initials were severed. Hermione gasped for air, her hands clawing at the stone floor. Her mind was a chaotic mess of his memories and hers. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his fear in the back of her throat. She looked across the room. Draco was slumped against a chair, his face buried in his hands. He was shaking. "I saw," he choked out. "I saw the manor. I saw her. I saw what she did to you." Hermione crawled toward him, her own eyes wet with tears. "And I saw what he did to you, Draco. I saw that you didn't have a choice." He looked up, his face a mask of agony. "There's always a choice. I was just too much of a coward to make the right one." "No," she said, reaching him and placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his forehead dropping against her collarbone. It was a gesture of absolute surrender. The warmth between them was no longer a theory. It was a sanctuary. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, sharper tension took its place. They were no longer enemies. They weren't quite friends. They were two broken souls who had seen too much of each other to ever look away again. Draco pulled back just enough to look at her. The air between them was thick with the scent of ozone and the dying candles. His gaze was intense, hovering on the verge of something he wasn't ready to say. "It's over," he whispered. "Is it?" Hermione asked. Before he could answer, a loud bang echoed from the corridor outside. The door to the room of requirement shuddered, as if someone was trying to force their way in. Draco jumped to his feet, pulling Hermione up with him. His face went cold and guarded once more. Someone followed us. The warmth was gone. The seesaw swung back to fear. "Who?" Hermione whispered, grabbing her bag. "I don't know," Draco said, his hand tightening around his wand. "But if we're caught together with a destroyed dark artifact, no one is going to believe we were synchronizing our magic." He looked at the door, then at her. For a moment, the trust they had just built flickered. "Go," he said, pushing her toward the back of the room where a secondary exit was forming. "I'll handle this. If they see you, your reputation is finished." "I'm not leaving you to take the blame." "Go, Hermione," he hissed, his eyes pleading. "Please, just this once, let me be the one who does the right thing." She hesitated, the doubt screaming in her mind. Was this a trick? Was he letting her go so he could hide the evidence? Or was he truly protecting her? The door began to creak open. Hermione turned and ran into the shadows of the secondary exit, her heart breaking with every step. She didn't see who entered. She only heard the cold, familiar voice of a Slytherin she thought was his friend, and the sound of Draco Malfoy lying through his teeth to save her. She had to know what was next. She had to know if he was safe. But as she emerged into a different corridor, she realized the locket wasn't the only thing that had been broken tonight. The wall between them was gone, and she was terrified of what would rush into the void. The aftermath of the room of requirement felt like a slow-motion collapse. Hermione spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of anxiety, her skin feeling too tight for her body. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that amber-lit room, feeling the jagged edges of Draco's soul scraping against hers. The connection hadn't fully severed. She could still feel a ghostly resonance, a thrumming in her chest that didn't belong to her. It was his guilt, cold and metallic, and his fear, sharp and suffocating. She waited for the news to break. She waited for the sound of his name being shouted in the great hall, for the sight of him being led away by auras. But the castle remained eerily normal. The stone walls kept their secrets, as they always did. It wasn't until Saturday morning that she saw him. The great hall was loud, the ceiling reflecting a dismal, weeping grey sky. Hermione was nursing a cup of black coffee, her eyes fixed on the entrance. When Draco finally walked in, the air seemed to leave her lungs. He wasn't escorted by professors. He walked alone, his posture more rigid than ever, his face a mask of porcelain indifference. But as he passed the Gryffindor table, his stride faltered for a fraction of a second. His grey eyes flicked toward her, a sharp, piercing look that lasted only a heartbeat. In that glance, she saw everything: the exhaustion, the warning, and a flickering spark of something that looked dangerously like gratitude. He sat at the very end of the Slytherin table, as far from his friends as possible. Theodore Nott and Blaise Zabini were whispering nearby, casting suspicious glances his way, but Draco ignored them, staring into his coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. Hermione couldn't take it. The silence was a cord tightening around her throat. She stood up, ignoring Ginny's questioning look, and walked out of the hall. She didn't head for the library. She headed for the Black Lake. The wind by the water was biting, carrying the scent of winter and wet earth. She stood by a gnarled willow tree, watching the giant squid break the surface of the dark, placid water. "You're not as subtle as you think you are, Granger." The voice came from behind her, low and gravelly. She didn't jump. She had been waiting for the sound of it. Draco stood a few paces away, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his black coat. He looked like he hadn't slept since they destroyed the locket. There were shadows under his eyes so dark they looked like bruises. "What happened?" she asked, turning to face him. "The door. I heard someone. I heard you talking." Draco walked to the water's edge, staring out at the horizon. "It was not. He's been following me too. He thought I was holding on to something valuable, something the old crowd could use. He saw us, Hermione. Or rather, he saw a girl's silhouette before I managed to shove the door shut." Hermione's heart hammered. "Does he know it was me?" "I told him it was a girl from Ravenclaw, someone he wouldn't bother checking up on." Draco turned his head, his gaze landing on her with unsettling intensity. "I told him I was shaking her down for information. He believed it because he wants to believe I'm still the same piece of filth I was in 5th year." The seesaw tipped. The warmth she had felt in the room of requirement curdled into a cold, sharp realization. He had lied to protect her, yes, but he had done it by leaning into his own villainy. He was playing the part of the monster again to keep her clean. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pity. "You shouldn't have to pretend to be that person anymore." "I'm not pretending, Hermione," he snapped, taking a step toward her. The sudden use of her name, shouted in frustration, made her flinch. "I am that person. I'm the boy who let Death Eaters into this school. I'm the boy who watched his classmates get tortured. One lie to Theodore Nott doesn't change the stain on my soul." "The locket showed me your soul, Draco," she countered, stepping into his space, her eyes burning. "It didn't show me a monster. It showed me a child who was suffocating. It showed me someone who was so afraid of failing his family that he almost destroyed himself." Draco laughed, but there was no sound to it, just a bitter twist of his lips. "And what does that change? Pity isn't the same thing as absolution." "I don't pity you," she whispered, her voice cracking. I understand you, and that's much worse, isn't it?" The tension between them shifted from ideological to something agonizingly physical. They were standing so close that the mist from their breath mingled in the cold air. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of everything they had seen inside each other's minds. The trauma, the loneliness, the unexpected bursts of light. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a moment the world stopped spinning. Hermione felt the magnetic pull, the cannot help but think side of the seesaw. She wanted to reach out. She wanted to touch the sharp line of his jaw, to see if he was as cold as he looked. But then he recoiled. His expression went flat, his eyes turning to flint. Don't look at me like there's something left to save. We destroyed the artifact, Granger. The mystery of DM is solved. Go back to your heroes. Go back to Potter and Weasley and the world where everything is simple and bright." "It's never been simple," she said, but he was already turning away. "Stay away from me," he said over his shoulder, his voice retreating back into the icy armor he wore so well. "Nott is suspicious. If we're seen together again, I won't be able to lie your way out of it next time." He walked away, his black coat fluttering in the wind like the wings of a crow. Hermione stayed by the lake until her fingers were numb and her toes were frozen. She felt a profound sense of loss, which was ridiculous. You couldn't lose something you never had. But the intimacy of the locket, the forced blending of their consciousness, had left a void that the cold wind couldn't fill. She went back to the castle, but the library felt like a cage. She found herself wandering the corridors, her eyes subconsciously searching for a flash of blonde hair. She was doubting everything. Was the connection they felt just a side effect of the dark magic? Was his protection of her just a lingering sense of debt? That evening, a small cream-coloured owl flew into the Gryffindor common room. It dropped a tiny folded piece of parchment into Hermione's lap and soared away before she could even look up. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it. There was no signature, just a single line written in elegant, sloping script. The locket wasn't the only thing that left a mark. Meet me where we first saw the smoke. Midnight. It was a trap. It was a mistake. It was the most dangerous thing she could do. Hermione stood up, her heart racing. She looked at Harry and Ron, who were laughing over a game of wizard's chess, blissfully unaware of the shadow world she was now inhabiting. She felt a surge of guilt, a sense of betrayal. She was keeping secrets from the people she loved for the sake of the man they hated. She waited until the fire in the common room had burned down to embers. She waited until the snores of her doormates were rhythmic and deep. Then she pulled on her cloak and slipped out into the night. The castle at midnight was a labyrinth of memories. Every shadow looked like a dementor. Every creak of the floor sounded like a scream. She reached the owlery, her breath coming in short white puffs. Draco was already there. He was leaning against the stone archway, staring up at the stars. He didn't look like a villain tonight. He looked like a boy who was tired of being a ghost. "You came," he said, not looking at her. "I shouldn't have," she replied, stepping into the circle of moonlight. He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes was different. The ice was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding vulnerability that made her heart ache. "I can't get it out of my head," he said, his voice a low thrumming in the quiet. "The way you felt, the way you didn't hate me when you saw the worst of it." "I couldn't," she said softly. "I saw why you did it, Draco. I saw the cost." He moved toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. The seesaw was gone now. There was only the pull. He stopped just inches away, his presence overwhelming her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her temple, his fingers trembling. "You're a nightmare, Granger," he whispered, his thumb brushing the very edge of her hairline. A brilliant, suffocating nightmare. The touch was electric. It was the first time he had touched her without the interference of a dark artifact or the need to shield her from a curse. It was just him and her. "Is that why you called me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To tell me I'm a nightmare?" "No," he said, his hand sliding down to her cheek, his palm warm against her skin. "I called you here because I'm terrified that if I don't see you, I'll start to believe the locket was a dream, and I can't go back to being alone in the dark, not after seeing your light." The tension was so thick, it felt like it might snap the stone under their feet. Hermione leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. For a moment, the war, the prejudices and the expectations of the world vanished. There was only the scent of mint and the sound of two hearts trying to find the same rhythm. But just as she began to tilt her head up, just as the distance between them began to vanish, Draco stiffened. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes snapping open. "Someone's here," he hissed, his hand flying to his wand. From the shadows of the stairwell, a cold, mocking laugh echoed. "How touching," a voice said. Theodore Nott stepped into the moonlight, his wand leveled directly at Hermione's heart. "I knew you were lying, Draco. I just didn't realize you were sinking quite this low." The betrayal in Nott's eyes was sharp, but the fear in Draco's was sharper. Hermione realized with a jolt of terror that the DM mystery had just become a matter of life and death. The owlery, once a sanctuary of cold air and starlight, suddenly felt like a cage. The stone walls, stained with the salt of the Highlands and the soot of ancient magic, seemed to shrink inward as Theodore Nott stepped fully into the silver light. His wand didn't waver, its tip glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence that cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. "A Gryffindor, Draco." Theo's voice was like silk dragged over broken glass. "And not just any Gryffindor, the Mudblood Princess herself. You really have lost your mind." Hermione felt the air turn to ice in her lungs. The slur hit her with the familiar dull ache of a bruise, but her focus remained on Draco. He had moved with a fluid, lethal speed, stepping in front of her, his body a rigid shield. His wand was out, held with a precision that spoke of years of dueling club and the much harsher lessons learned in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor. "Leave, Theo," Draco said. His voice was no longer the broken whisper of the boy by the lake. It was the cold, authoritative tone of a Malfoy heir who had nothing left to lose. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Theo laughed, a high, thin sound that didn't reach his eyes. The Carrows would have loved this. The Prince of Slytherin pawing at Potter's leavings. "My father is in Azkaban because of people like her. And here you are, trysting in the middle of the night." "What were you doing, Draco?" Begging for a character reference. The tension in Draco's shoulders was so extreme that Hermione feared he might literally shatter. She could see the vein pulsing in his neck, the white-knuckle grip he had on his hawthorn wand. The seesaw of their relationship was currently at its most agonizing point. The trust they had built was being used as a weapon against them. "She's here because of the artifact," Draco lied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "She's the one who found it. I was interrogating her." "Interrogating her with your hand on her face?" Theo took a predatory step forward. "I'm not as blind as Crabbe was, Draco. I saw the way you looked at her. It was pathetic. It was treason." "I don't owe anyone loyalty anymore," Draco roared, the sound echoing off the rafters and sending a dozen owls fluttering into the night air. "Not to your father, not to the Dark Lord's ghost, and certainly not to you." Theo's eyes narrowed to slits. Maybe not, but the Board of Governors might be interested to know that a Malfoy is fraternizing with a war hero against school regulations. Your probation is a fragile thing, Draco. One wrong move and you're back in a cell. Hermione felt the panic rise in her throat. She couldn't let him do this. She couldn't let Draco's second chance be ruined because of a moment of vulnerability in the moonlight. She stepped out from behind Draco, her own wand raised, her mind racing through 1,000 defensive spells. "He was helping me destroy a dark object, not," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "An object that belonged to his family. It was dangerous, and he took the risk to neutralize it. If you report him, you're reporting someone who just saved the school from a curse." Theo looked at her, his expression twisting into a sneer of pure loathing. "Keep your mouth shut, Granger. Nobody asked for the lecture. You're just a trophy he's trying to collect to prove he's one of the good guys now." "That's enough!" Draco's voice was a whip crack. In an instant, the air in the owlery changed. The magic became heavy, oppressive, and dark. Draco wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was protecting her, and that shift in intent changed the very nature of his power. "If you breathe a word of this to anyone," Draco said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "I will ensure that every secret your father left in that manor is handed over to the ministry. I know where the ledgers are, Theo. I know who paid the bribes. I will burn your house to the ground to keep her name out of your mouth." The silence that followed was absolute. Theo's wand hand drifted down, just an inch, but it was enough. He looked at Draco as if seeing him for the first time, not as a fallen peer, but as someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "You'd destroy us all for her?" Theo asked, genuinely stunned. "In a heartbeat," Draco replied. Theo stared at them for a long, agonizing minute. The wind whistled through the stone arches, carrying the scent of the coming snow. Finally, he tucked his wand into his robes. "You're a fool, Draco. She'll never choose you. Not when she has the chosen one and the weasel to keep her warm. You're just a project to her. A way to prove she's so brilliant she can even fix a Malfoy." He turned on his heel and disappeared into the shadows of the stairwell, his footsteps receding until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind. Draco didn't move. He stood with his back to Hermione, his head bowed, his wand still clutched in his hand. The adrenaline that had fueled his defiance seemed to drain out of him, leaving a hollowed-out shell. Hermione reached out, her fingers brushing the wool of his sleeve. "Draco." He flinched as if she had struck him. He spun around, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The warmth from before had been replaced by a jagged, freezing wall of doubt. "He's right," Draco rasped, his voice breaking. "Everything he said, he's right. I'm a risk to you. I'm a stain on your reputation. If people find out about this, about us—" "There is no us yet, Draco," she said softly, though the word yet hung in the air like a promise. "And I don't care what they think." "You should," he cried, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "You have a life, Hermione. You have a future at the ministry. You have people who love you. I have a name that people spit on. I have a mark on my arm that won't stop itching. Why are you even here? Why didn't you just leave the locket in the library?" "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," she confessed, the truth pouring out of her before she could stop it. Draco stopped pacing. He looked at her, his silver eyes wide and searching. "I saw your memories," she continued, taking a step toward him. "I felt your loneliness. I felt the way you hated yourself for every choice you didn't get to make. I didn't see a project, Draco. I saw a man who was brave enough to try and destroy his own legacy because it was the right thing to do. I'm not brave," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm just tired of being afraid." "Then stop being afraid of me," she said. She reached for his hand, her fingers sliding into his. His skin was cold, but as their palms met, she felt that familiar humming resonance again, the synchronization they had felt in the room of requirement. It wasn't the locket anymore. It was them. Draco looked down at their joined hands. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a slow, tentative movement that felt like a prayer. The approach phase of the seesaw was reaching its peak, the gravity of their shared trauma pulling them together with an irresistible force. But the doubt still lingered in the corners of his mind. Hermione could see it in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. "The locket," he said, his voice thick. "It's gone. We don't have an excuse to meet anymore." "I don't need an excuse," she said. He finally looked up, and the intensity of his gaze was enough to make her knees weak. He looked like a man who was starving and had just been offered a feast he wasn't sure he was allowed to eat. "If we do this," he said, his voice a low, warning growl, "there's no going back. If Not tells anyone, if the rumors start, I can't protect you from the world, Hermione. I can barely protect myself." "Then let's not worry about the world tonight," she whispered. She moved into his space, her body inches from his. The scent of him, mint, rain, and the faint metallic tang of his magic enveloped her. She could hear the rapid thud of his heart, a frantic human sound that mirrored her own. Draco leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm against her lips, a tantalizing promise of what was to come. "I've spent 7 years hating you because it was easier than admitting I was fascinated by you," he whispered. "I've spent 7 years trying to be what they wanted me to be." "And what do you want to be now?" she asked. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression a mixture of agony and hope. "I want to be yours, even if it's only for tonight, even if it destroys me." He reached up, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. The touch was so tender, so completely at odds with the boy she had known, that it brought tears to her eyes. The tension was unbearable. It was a slow burn that had been smouldering since the moment she found the locket, since the moment they touched in the library, since the war had first forced them onto opposite sides of a line they were now prepared to cross. But just as he began to lower his head, just as the first kiss was about to break the dam of years of resentment and longing, a low, rhythmic thrumming echoed through the owlery. It wasn't Not. It wasn't an owl. It was the locket. Or rather, it was where the locket had been. On the floor, in the spot where the silver had shattered, a pool of thick black liquid was bubbling up through the cracks in the stone. The DM wasn't just a label of ownership. It was a seal. And by breaking the locket, they hadn't just destroyed an artifact. They had released whatever was trapped inside. "Draco," Hermione whispered, pointing at the floor. He looked down, his face going deathly pale. "It's not over," he breathed, his hand tightening around hers. The locket. It was a cage for something much worse. The black liquid began to rise, forming a towering, shadowy figure that pulsed with the same grief-eating magic they had fought before. The atmosphere in the owlery turned from romantic to lethal in a heartbeat. "I need to know what's next," Hermione thought, her heart sinking. They were being pulled back into the darkness, just as they had found the light. The shadow didn't have a face, but it had an intent. It rose from the floorboards like ink dropped into clear water, expanding until it brushed the rafters of the owlery. The air temperature plummeted, turning their breath into thick plumes of white mist. This was the raw, unrefined essence of the locket, a concentrated mass of generational trauma and black family malice that had been waiting for the vessel to break so it could find a living host. Draco shoved Hermione behind him, his wand arm trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer effort of resisting the psychic weight pressing against them. "It's a spectre of remorse," he shouted over the rising howl of the wind that had suddenly begun to circle inside the room. "It doesn't attack the body, Hermione. It attacks the mind. It feeds on the things we're most ashamed of." Hermione tried to raise her wand, but her arm felt like it was made of lead. The shadow pulsed, and suddenly the stone walls of the owlery vanished. She wasn't standing in the cold tower anymore. She was back in the forest during the year of hunting horcruxes. She felt the hunger gnawing at her stomach, the cold dampness of the tent, and the crushing weight of Ron's departure. She saw the look in Harry's eyes, the burden of being the savior, and she felt the stinging guilt of every person she couldn't save. "It's your fault," the shadow hissed into her mind, 1,000 voices overlapping. "You were the clever one. You should have known. You should have been faster." "Hermione, don't listen to it!" Draco's voice sounded miles away. She looked toward him and saw that he was struggling with his own demons. The shadow had coiled around him like a serpent. He was on his knees, his eyes wide and glazed. He was seeing the manor. He was seeing the Dark Lord at his dining table. He was seeing the moment the needle pierced his skin to ink the mark. The seesaw of their connection was being forced into a downward spiral of shared agony. The warmth they had found moments ago was being sucked away, replaced by a void so cold it felt like death. "Draco, look at me!" Hermione screamed, fighting through the mental fog. She crawled toward him, her fingers scraping against the rough stone. Every inch felt like a mile. The shadow lashed out, a whip of darkness striking her across the chest, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated sorrow through her heart. She saw her parents' faces, blank, empty, not knowing who she was. She reached him, her hand slamming onto his shoulder. "Draco, it's not real. It's the grief. It's the DM. It's the legacy, not us." Draco's head snapped up. His face was a mask of sweat and tears. I can't stop it, Hermione. It's too heavy. It's everything I've ever done. It's all the people I hurt." "We destroy it together," she cried, grabbing his wand hand with hers, mirroring the stance they had taken in the room of requirement. The harmonic surge. "We don't use light magic. We use truth." Think of the library. Think of the lake. Think of right now. She poured every ounce of her will into the connection. She didn't think of spells or incantations. She thought of the way his hand had felt on her cheek. She thought of the way he had stood up to Not. She thought of the fragile, beautiful possibility of a world where they weren't defined by their scars. Draco gasped, his fingers tightening around hers. He saw what she was showing him. He saw himself through her eyes, not as a monster, but as a man deserving of a second chance. The silver light began to leak from their joined hands again, but this time it wasn't a violent explosion. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. "Now!" she urged. Together they shouted a wordless cry of defiance. The silver light erupted, not outward, but inward, pierces the heart of the shadow. The spectre let out a final, haunting shriek, the sound of 100 years of mourning finally being silenced, and dissolved into a fine grey ash that was instantly carried away by the wind. Silence returned to the owlery. The black liquid on the floor had vanished. The air was still cold, but the predatory weight was gone. Draco slumped against her, his head falling into the crook of her neck. He was shaking so violently that Hermione thought he might break. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, her own tears falling into his hair. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice raw. "It's really gone." They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors in the wreckage of a haunting. The tension between them had shifted yet again. The repulsion was dead. The doubt had been burned away by the spectre. There was only a terrifying, bone-deep warmth, a realization that they were now irrevocably linked. They had shared their worst nightmares and come out the other side together. Draco pulled back slowly, his hands lingering on her waist. He looked at her with an expression of such profound vulnerability that it made her heart ache. He looked like a man who had been drowned and had just taken his first breath of air. "You saved me," he whispered. Again. "We saved each other," she corrected, her hand reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek. He caught her hand, kissing the palm of it with a desperation that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I don't know how to do this, Hermione. I don't know how to be the person you see when you look at me." "You already are that person," she said. "You just have to stop hiding him." He looked at her lips, the distance between them narrowing to a hair's breadth. The seesaw was gone. There was only the inevitable fall. The air was thick with the scent of mint, rain, and the lingering ozone of the magic they had just cast. But Draco paused, his eyes searching hers one last time. "If I kiss you, there's no turning back. I won't let you go. I'm a selfish man, Hermione. I've spent my life losing things. I won't lose you." "Then don't," she whispered. He leaned in, his lips just a fraction of an inch from hers, when the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs again. But this time, they weren't knots. They were heavy, official, and accompanied by the flickering light of several lanterns. "Professor McGonagall!" Draco hissed, his eyes widening in alarm. They sprang apart, the physical distance between them feeling like a chasm. Hermione smoothed her hair, her heart racing. They had destroyed the artifact, they had defeated the Spectre, but the DM mystery had left a trail of evidence they couldn't explain. "Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger." McGonagall's voice was sharp, cutting through the night air. She stepped into the owlery, followed by Professor Flitwick. Her eyes took in the scene, the ash on the floor, the dishevelled state of their clothes, the raw emotion written on their faces. "Care to explain why the two of you are in the owlery at 2 a.m, creating enough magical turbulence to set off every alarm in my office?" Draco stepped forward, his face returning to its mask of cold indifference. But Hermione reached out and caught his hand behind his back, her fingers lacing with his. He froze, his fingers tightening around hers in return. "It was the locket, Professor," Hermione said, her voice clear and unwavering. She didn't look at Draco, but she felt the surge of his magic through their touch. We were finishing what was started 50 years ago. McGonagall looked from Hermione to Draco, her gaze lingering on their hidden, joined hands. She wasn't a fool. She saw the shift in the world. She saw the way the lioness was protecting the dragon. "I see," the headmistress said softly. "Well, it appears the mystery of the restricted section has been solved. However, regulations are regulations. 10 points from Gryffindor and Slytherin for being out of bed." She turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. "And Mr. Malfoy, your mother sent a letter. She's pleased that the family heirloom has been laid to rest. She thinks it's time for new traditions." The professors left, their lanterns fading into the darkness. Hermione and Draco were alone again. The moon had moved across the sky, casting a long silver path between them. Draco looked at her, the mask finally shattering for good. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, pulled her into his arms, and buried his face in the space between her neck and shoulder. "New traditions," he murmured against her skin. He pulled back, his hands framing her face. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady heat. He leaned down, and this time there were no interruptions. The first kiss was hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It tasted of salt and mint. It was the sound of a wall falling. It was the feeling of a war finally ending. Hermione sighed into his mouth, her hands winding into his hair, pulling him closer. The second kiss was different. It was a claim. It was the DM carving itself into something new. It was the approach, the repulsion, the trust, and the betrayal all melting into a single, white-hot point of contact. As the snow began to fall outside the owlery windows, Hermione realized that the mystery of who is DM had a very simple answer. He was the man who had been lost in the dark, and she was the one who had followed him until they both found the light. But as they broke apart, breathless and shivering in the cold, Draco looked at her with a smirk that was finally, truly his own. "You realize Potter is going to kill me, right?" "Probably," Hermione laughed, pulling him back in. "But I'm the brightest witch of her age. I think I can handle one overprotective Gryffindor." "I count on it," he whispered, before leaning down to seal the promise again. The story of the locket was over. Their story was just beginning. The morning after, the owlery felt like waking up in a world that had been recalibrated. The sky over Hogwarts was a brilliant, painful blue, the kind that only comes after a cleansing storm. For Hermione, every familiar stone of the castle seemed to hum with a secret frequency. She sat at the Gryffindor table, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, feeling the phantom pressure of Draco's lips against her own. The seesaw had not stopped, however. It had merely changed its rhythm. Now, the approach was followed by a terrifying sense of exposure. Every time the great hall doors creaked open, her heart executed a painful somersault. When Draco finally entered, he didn't look at her. He walked with his head high, the icy mask firmly back in place. But as he passed, his hand brushed the back of her bench, a fleeting, rough contact of wool against wood that sent a jolt of lightning through her spine. It was a silent communication. "I am here. I am the same. But we are dangerous." By mid-afternoon, the sanctuary of the library felt suffocating. Hermione found herself wandering toward the clock tower, her mind replaying the moment the spectre of remorse had dissolved. She was so lost in the internal monologue of her own fears. What would Harry say? What would the world do to him if they knew? That she didn't notice the shadow following her until she reached the landing of the stone staircase. "Granger!" She turned. It wasn't Draco. It was Pansy Parkinson. Pansy looked different in the daylight of the 8th year. The sharpness was still there, the bobbed hair and the narrowed eyes, but the cruelty had been blunted by the weight of the war. She looked at Hermione not with hatred, but with a weary, clinical curiosity. "He's a mess, you know," Pansy said, leaning against the stone railing. She didn't use names. She didn't have to. "He came back to the common room last night, looking like he'd gone 10 rounds with a pensive. Not his talking, by the way. He's telling anyone who will listen that Malfoy has gone soft for the Golden Girl." Hermione's pulse quickened. "And what are you doing, Pansy? Coming to deliver a warning? Or a hex?" Pansy stepped closer, the scent of expensive, heavy perfume clashing with the cold air of the corridor. "I'm telling you that he doesn't know how to be happy. He thinks that if he takes even a step toward you, the ground will swallow him whole. He's waiting for the betrayal, Hermione. He's waiting for you to realize that he's not worth the trouble." "He is worth it," Hermione said, her voice hard and certain. "Is he? Because while you're playing the hero, he's drowning in the fact that he can't offer you anything but a disgraced name and a haunted house." Pansy's eyes softened just a fraction. "Don't break him further. If you're going to do this, do it with your eyes open. He's not a project. He's a man who has forgotten how to breathe without permission." Pansy walked away, leaving Hermione in a swirl of perfume and doubt. The cold phase of the seesaw rushed back. Was she doing this because she loved the mystery? Was she drawn to the DM because it was a puzzle she could solve? Or was it the man himself? She needed to see him. Not in a tower, not in a library, but somewhere real. She sent a message. A simple, charmed coin she'd kept from the days of the DA, modified to vibrate against the skin. She knew he carried his in his pocket. A few minutes later, the coin in her own pocket hummed. The astronomy tower. Sunset. When she arrived, the sky was bleeding orange and violet. The wind was fierce up here, whipping her curls into a chaotic halo. Draco was standing by the telescope, his back to her. He had shed his school tie, his collar open, looking more like the boy she'd seen in the room of requirement, raw and unadorned. "Pansy spoke to me," she said, her voice carried away by the wind. Draco didn't turn. "She has a habit of meddling. She thinks she's protecting me, or perhaps she's protecting the status quo. She said you're waiting for me to leave." He turned then. His face was etched with a profound, quiet agony. The sunset caught the silver of his eyes, turning them to liquid fire. "Aren't you? It's the logical conclusion, Granger. You're the hero. You're the one everyone loves. Eventually, the novelty of the revolving door of redemption will wear off, and you'll realize that I'm just me. And me is a very dark place to live." Hermione walked toward him, her boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. She didn't stop until she was in his space, her breath hitching as the scent of him, mint and the cold winter air, filled her senses. "I don't care about the novelty," she said, reaching out to grasp the lapels of his coat. "And I don't care about the status quo. I care about the person who shielded me from a grief eater. I care about the man who lied to his own friends to keep me safe. That man is a fool, Draco whispered, his hands coming up to cover hers, pinning them against his chest. She could feel his heart. It was racing, a frantic, stuttering beat. Then let's be fools together, she countered. The tension between them was no longer about mystery or artifacts. It was the tension of two bodies realizing they were the only anchors left in a world that had tried to drown them both. Draco leaned down, his forehead dropping against hers. He smelled of wood smoke and desperation. I can't give you a quiet life, Hermione, he murmured against her skin. I can't give you a life where people don't whisper. I can't even guarantee my own father won't disown me the moment he hears of this. I've never wanted a quiet life, she said, her hands sliding up to cup his face. Her thumbs traced the sharp, elegant lines of his cheekbones. I want a life that matters, and you matter to me. The warmth flooded back, overwhelming the doubt. Draco's hands slid down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The physical proximity was a revelation, the way her height fit perfectly against his, the way the world seemed to narrow down to the heat radiating between them. He kissed her then, and it wasn't the tentative question of the owlery. It was an answer. It was a fierce, possessive claim that tasted of everything they had survived. It was the taste of the library dust, the mountain rain, and the dark ink of the locket. Hermione melted into him, her fingers tangling in the soft silk of his hair, pulling him closer as if she could pull his very soul into her own. They stayed there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the stars beginning to puncture the velvet dark. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a blanket. D.M., he whispered into the crook of her neck, his breath hot and grounding. Did you know my middle name is Lucius? I hate it. I've always hated it. Then we'll change what the initials stand for, she said, pulling back to look at him. They don't have to be a claim of ownership from the past. They can be something else. Like what? Like, definitely mine, she teased, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face. Draco let out a short, surprised laugh, the first real sound of joy she had ever heard from him. It transformed his face, erasing the years of war and leaving only the handsome, brilliant man underneath. He leaned down and kissed her again, a soft, lingering touch that felt like a beginning. But as they looked out over the darkened grounds of Hogwarts, they both knew the truce was temporary. Below them, in the great hall, the world was still turning. The prejudices were still there. Nott was still talking. The ministry was still watching. They're going to come for us, you know, Draco said, his voice regaining its serious edge. The moment we walk down those stairs, the seesaw starts again. The looks, the letters, the outrage. Let them come, Hermione said, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. She felt it then, the final shift. The trust was no longer a fragile thing they had built in a tower. It was a foundation. Whatever was coming next, the conflict with their friends, the judgment of society, the long road to a future they hadn't yet written, they would face it as a pair. I need to know what's next, she thought. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the answer. The final transition from secret to reality happened not with a shout, but in the crushing, mundane silence of the great hall on a Monday morning. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of charred sausages and the rustle of the Daily Prophet. News at Hogwarts had a way of travelling faster than a firebolt, and by the time Hermione took her seat at the Gryffindor table, the air felt electric. Theodore Nott had done his work well. The whispers followed her like a physical trail of slime. She saw Ginny looking at her with a mixture of confusion and hurt. She saw Ron staring at his plate, his ears a bright, warning shade of red. But her eyes, as if tethered by an invisible cord, drifted toward the Slytherin table. Draco was already there. He was surrounded by a vacuum of space, his housemates having pulled their benches away as if he were carrying the dragon pox. He sat perfectly still, his spine a rigid line of defiance, staring straight ahead. He looked like he was bracing for an impact that had been years in the making. Hermione didn't think. For once, the girl who lived by logic and rules let the internal monologue of her heart take the lead. She stood up. The sound of her bench scraping against the stone floor was like a thunderclap in the sudden hush of the hall. She walked, not toward the exit, but across the vast, open space between the lions and the snakes. Every eye in the school followed her. She felt the seesaw of repulsion from the crowd, the shock, the judgment, the betrayal. But as she reached the end of the Slytherin table, the only thing she felt was the warmth radiating from the man in front of her. "Granger," Draco whispered as she stopped beside him. His voice was a raw thread of sound. "What are you doing? Go back. You're destroying everything." "I'm deciding what's mine," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall. She sat down beside him. It was a simple act, but it felt like redrawing the maps of the wizarding world. She reached out and placed her hand on the table, palm up, a silent invitation, a final bridge. Draco looked at her hand as if it were a miracle he didn't deserve. Slowly, his fingers trembling with a vulnerability that shattered the last of his porcelain mask, he reached out and laced his fingers with hers. His skin was hot, his grip desperate. The hall erupted. Shouts, gasps, and the clatter of cutlery filled the air. But for Hermione, the noise was distant, like waves crashing against a far-off shore. Inside the circle of their joined hands, there was only peace. "You're a mad woman," Draco murmured, his grey eyes finally meeting hers. They were swimming with a mixture of terror and an adoration so bright it was painful to look at. "And you're a Malfoy," she countered with a soft, watery smile. "We're both destined for a bit of trouble." The resolution of the DM mystery had brought them here, to a place where the shadows of the past could no longer dictate the light of the present. The locket was gone, the Spectre was burned away, and the initials no longer stood for a dead grandmother's grief. They stood for a choice. They left the great hall together, walking through the gauntlet of their peers with their heads held high. They didn't stop until they reached the stone bridge, where the wind from the mountains blew fresh and clean, carrying away the stagnant air of the castle. Draco pulled her into the shadow of a stone buttress, his hands immediately finding her waist. The tension between them had reached its final beautiful breaking point. There were no more secrets, no more artifacts, and no more excuses to hide. "I have nothing to give you but a long, difficult road," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "There will be trials at the ministry. My father will fight this. Your friends will take time to understand. I've never been afraid of a difficult road, Draco," she whispered, her hands winding around his neck, pulling him down. As long as it's the one that leads to you. He didn't wait any longer. He kissed her with a ferocity that spoke of every year he had spent hating himself, every night he had spent in the dark, and every second he had spent wanting her from across a crowded room. It was a kiss of fire and ice, of the cannot stand it and the cannot help but think. It was the final, definitive answer to the question of who they were to each other. Hermione poured all her intelligence, all her strength, and all her newfound vulnerability into the embrace. She felt his heart beating against hers, a steady, rhythmic drum that signaled the end of the war within him. They broke apart only when the air was gone, their foreheads still pressed together. Draco's thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch lingering on the skin he had once been taught to despise. "So," he said, a ghost of his trademark smirk returning to his lips, "who is DM, Hermione?" She looked into his eyes, seeing the man she had rescued and the man who had rescued her in return. "DM is the man I choose," she said firmly. "He's the one who stayed." Draco pulled her back into his arms, burying his face in her hair as the first snowflakes of a real winter began to dance around them. The seesaw had finally come to rest, perfectly balanced between two souls who had found their own brand of magic in the ruins of an old world. The mystery was solved. The artifact was destroyed. But the love that had grown from the ashes was the most powerful magic either of them had ever encountered. As they walked back toward the castle to face whatever came next, Hermione realized that the DM initials on the locket hadn't been a warning. They had been a destination, and she was finally, irrevocably home. The cold air of the Highlands couldn't touch them. The whispers of the students couldn't reach them. There was only the warmth of their joined hands and the silver light of a future they were brave enough to build together. Draco stopped one last time before the heavy oak doors, looking at her with a look of such profound peace that it took her breath away. He leaned down, catching her lips in one last lingering kiss, a promise sealed in the quiet of the morning. "Together?" he asked. "Always," she replied. And as the doors opened to a world that was ready to judge them, they stepped through the threshold, hand in hand, leaving the shadows of the DM mystery behind them forever. The story of the locket was over, but the story of Draco and Hermione was just beginning its first brilliant chapter. The glass walls of Hogwarts' fragile peace did not just crack. They shattered into 1,000 jagged needles. The morning after the Great Hall confrontation was characterized by a silence that was far more violent than any shouting match. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, a lone island in a sea of red and gold. She could feel the stares of her housemates like physical weights against her back. They weren't looking at her as the war hero or the brightest witch anymore. They were looking at her as if she were a stranger who had brought a predator into their sanctuary. Across the hall, the isolation was even more severe. Draco sat alone, the dark wood of the Slytherin table stretching out around him like an empty wasteland. He didn't look up. He didn't eat. He simply stared at a spot on the stone floor, his face a mask of such profound emptiness that it made Hermione's chest ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm. Then the owls arrived. The Morning Post was usually a chaotic, cheerful affair, but today The beat of wings sounded like the approach of an army. A massive, charcoal-grey eagle owl descended, its talons clicking sharply against the Slytherin table in front of Draco. It carried a heavy, crimson envelope, a howler. The hall fell into a deathly hush. Draco didn't move. He didn't reach for it. He simply sat there as the envelope began to smoke, its edges curling and turning black. With a sound like a controlled explosion, the letter tore itself open. It wasn't a voice that emerged. It was a roar of pure aristocratic fury. It was the voice of Lucius Malfoy, amplified by the cold stone of the hall, dripping with a venom that made the air turn sour. "Draco, Lucius Malfoy," the voice thundered. "You have spit upon the name that gave you breath. You have dragged the pride of the Blacks and the Malfoys into the dirt for the sake of a mudblood. Do not seek counsel. Do not seek shelter. From this moment, you are no son of mine. The manor is closed. The vaults are sealed. You are nothing." The letter shredded itself into a cloud of red confetti, which drifted slowly down onto Draco's shoulders like drops of blood. The silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, Hermione couldn't breathe. She looked at Draco. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't moved a single muscle. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning and was still standing only because his nerves had been fused together. He stood up slowly. Without a word, without looking at anyone, he walked out of the great hall. His footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous room. Hermione didn't care about the points. She didn't care about the stairs. She shoved her plate aside and ran after him. She found him in a forgotten, dust-choked classroom on the 3rd floor. The windows were cracked and the sunlight filtered through the grime in sickly yellow streaks. Draco was standing by a broken desk, his hands gripping the edges so hard the wood was groaning. "Draco," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "Don't," he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Don't come near me, Hermione. He was right. I am nothing. I have no name. I have no future. I am a ghost in a school that hates me, and I have just lost the only world I ever knew." "You haven't lost the world," she said, stepping closer, her heart breaking at the sight of his trembling shoulders. "You've lost a cage. You've lost a name that was a burden, not a gift." "It was my life," he shouted, spinning around. His eyes were wild, red-rimmed, and filled with a raw, agonizing terror. "Every meal I ate, every book I read, every breath I took was because I was a Malfoy. I don't know how to be anyone else. I don't know how to exist without the weight of that legacy." "Then let me teach you," she said, her voice steady and fierce. She reached him, her hands finding his arms, holding him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The seesaw of their relationship was at its most dangerous point, the absolute repulsion of his old life clashing with the desperate need for something new. "He can take your money, Draco. He can take your house, but he cannot take the soul I saw in that locket. He cannot take the man who stayed behind to destroy the Spectre. That man doesn't need a manor. That man needs a heart." Draco let out a strangled, broken sob and collapsed against her. He didn't fall to his knees. He fell into her, his forehead resting on her shoulder as he wept for the loss of a father who had never truly loved him. Hermione held him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her chin resting on his head. She felt the vibrations of his grief, the deep, shuddering release of years of performance and fear. In the dim light of the ruined classroom, the atmospheric tension shifted. It was no longer about the mystery of DM or the thrill of a secret. It was the heavy, grounding reality of two people choosing to rebuild on a foundation of rubble. "I have nothing to give you," he whispered against her neck, his breath hot and damp. "You have yourself," she replied, "and that is more than enough." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his silver eyes searching hers for a lie. He saw only the unwavering, stubborn loyalty of a lioness. He reached up, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize she had shed. "Why?" he asked. "Why me, Hermione, after everything I did? After every word I spat at you? Because you were the only one who looked at me and didn't see a symbol," she said softly. "You saw a challenge, and I saw a man who was fighting a war inside himself every single day. I'd rather have a man who struggles to be good than one who is good only because it's easy." The proximity between them became electric once more. The grief was still there, but it was being pushed back by a rising, defiant warmth. Draco leaned in, his lips grazing hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation. It was a kiss of survival. It was a seal on a new contract, one where the terms were written in their own blood and shared breath. "They'll never stop," Draco murmured against her lips. "The world, they'll always see the mark." "Then we'll give them something else to look at," Hermione said, her hands sliding up to cup his face. "We'll show them that a Malfoy and a Granger can create a world they aren't even brave enough to imagine." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands finding her waist and pulling her so close there was no air between them. The approach was complete. The trust was a solid, unbreakable thing. As the sun shifted, casting a golden glow over the dust motes in the air, Hermione realized that the glass castle of their old lives had to break so they could build something stronger from the shards. But the peace was short-lived. A shadow fell across the doorway. It wasn't a student. It was a house elf, dressed in a clean, crisp pillowcase embroidered with the Malfoy crest. It was Mippy, his mother's personal servant. "Master Draco!" the elf squeaked, its large eyes filled with sorrow. "Mistress Narcy is calling. She says the manor is not the only place with secrets. She asks you to come to the Black Lake at midnight. She says she has something that belongs to you, not to your father, to you." The elf vanished with a soft pop, leaving the room colder than before. Draco looked at Hermione, the fear returning to his eyes. "My mother, she's moving against him." "Or she's trying to bring you back," Hermione cautioned. "No," Draco said, his jaw tightening with a newfound resolve. "She wouldn't send Mippy if it were a trap. She's terrified. If Lucius found out she was contacting me..." The conflict was clear. The past was reaching out its hand, trying to pull them back into the shadows. The DM saga wasn't over. It was merely evolving. "I'm going with you," Hermione said. "It's too dangerous." "Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "We are duo mundi now. Two worlds. I'm not letting you go back into that darkness alone." He looked at her, and for the first time, the seesaw didn't tip. It stayed perfectly level. He nodded, leaning down to press one last lingering kiss to her forehead. "Midnight," he whispered. "At the lake. We face her together." As they left the classroom, the feeling of what comes next was a heavy, thrumming presence in the air. The story of the locket was dead, but the legacy of the name was about to be challenged in the moonlight. The black lake at midnight was a mirror of liquid obsidian, reflecting a moon that seemed too cold for the living. The frost had begun to colonize the reeds at the water's edge, turning them into jagged glass spears that crunched underfoot. Hermione walked beside Draco, her hand entwined with his. The heat from his palm was the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. They didn't speak. The atmosphere was too thick with the scent of pine and impending judgment for words. The seesaw of their relationship had reached a plateau of shared destiny, but the external world was tilting violently. Hermione could feel the weight of the war hero mantle slipping off her shoulders, replaced by something heavier and far more complicated. She wasn't just Hermione Granger anymore. She was the girl who had crossed the line. "She'll be standing by the old boathouse," Draco murmured, his voice barely a ripple in the silence. "It's the only place the Manor's enchantments can't reach through the Floo network bypass." As they rounded the bend, a figure emerged from the mist. Narcissa Malfoy stood like a statue carved from moonlight. She was draped in heavy, midnight blue velvet, her silver blonde hair pulled back so tightly it made her sharp features look ethereal and predatory. She looked every inch the black she had been born, a woman who had survived the reign of a Dark Lord by being more cunning than the monsters at her table. When her eyes fell on their joined hands, her expression didn't shift by a single millimeter. Not a gasp, not a sneer. Only a long, lingering silence that felt like a trial. "Draco," she said. Her voice was a haunting melody, thin and sharp. "Mother," Draco replied, his grip on Hermione's hand tightening until it was almost painful. He didn't let go. He stepped forward, pulling Hermione with him into the circle of Narcissa's gaze. "You sent for me." Narcissa stepped closer, the silk of her robes hissing against the frosted grass. She looked at Hermione, her eyes scanning her face with a terrifying clinical intensity. It wasn't the look of a woman seeing a mudblood. It was the look of a mother weighing the soul of the person who had stolen her son's loyalty. "Miss Granger," Narcissa acknowledged, "I see the stories were not exaggerated. You are as stubborn as you are brave." "I am loyal to those who deserve it, Mrs. Malfoy," Hermione countered, her chin lifting. Narcissa let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "Loyalty is a dangerous currency, child, especially when the bank is burning." She turned her focus back to Draco. "Your father has gone mad with shame. He's purging the archives. He intends to strike your name from the family tapestry by the next new moon. He wants to erase the very memory of your birth." Draco's face went pale, but he didn't flinch. "He already did that in the Great Hall, Mother. He made his choice. I've made mine." "Have you?" Narcissa reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a small velvet pouch. It didn't hum like the locket. It felt silent, heavy, and ancient. "He thinks he can destroy the Malfoy legacy, but he forgets that the Malfoys are only half of your blood. The Blacks do not erase their own. We consume them, or we protect them." She held the pouch out to Draco. "This is the primary vault key to the Black Estate, not the Malfoy vaults. Those are gone to you. This is my inheritance. It contains the library of my sisters, the gold of my father, and the deeds to the properties in France. It is yours. Now." Draco stared at the pouch as if it were a coiled serpent. why? You're risking everything by being here. If he finds out..." "He will not find out," Narcissa snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce fire. "He is a broken man clinging to a broken throne. I will not watch my only son starve because his father's pride is larger than his heart. Take it. Use it to build a house where he cannot enter." Draco reached out, his fingers brushing his mother's as he took the pouch. In that moment, the seesaw of his identity swung toward a new kind of power. He wasn't a disinherited beggar. He was the heir to a darker, older throne. But Narcissa wasn't finished. She turned her gaze to Hermione. "And you? Do you think you can protect him? The world will not be as kind as I am tonight. They will call you a traitor to your blood. They will call him a parasite. They will try to tear you apart just to see if you bleed the same color." "Let them try," Hermione said, her voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal confidence. Narcissa looked at them both, the lioness and the dragon, and for the first time, a small, sad smile touched her lips. "I spent my life choosing the winning side. I am beginning to think that perhaps I didn't know what winning looked like." She reached out, her gloved hand brushing Draco's cheek in a gesture that was so fleeting it might have been an illusion. "Do not come back to the manor, Draco. Not until the fire has burned out. Live. Just live." She turned and vanished into the mist before they could say another word. The silence that returned was different. The weight of the world felt lighter, yet the gravity of their path felt more absolute. Draco looked down at the velvet pouch in his hand, then at Hermione. "She gave us a way out," he whispered. "France, the Black Estates. We could leave all of this behind. The whispers, the war, the judgment. We could disappear." Hermione looked at him, her heart thumping against her ribs. The temptation was enormous. A life of quiet libraries and sun-drenched vineyards, away from the scars of Hogwarts. It was the ultimate warmth, the ultimate escape. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the shadow of the locket. She saw the man who had stood his ground in the owlery. "Is that what you want, Draco?" she asked softly. "To run away again?" Draco looked at the castle, the silhouette of Hogwarts rising against the stars like a jagged crown. "No," he said, his voice hardening into something unbreakable. "If we run, they win. If we run, we prove them right, that we are a mistake that needs to be hidden." He took the pouch and shoved it into his pocket. He turned to her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her lips. The tension between them was no longer about conflict. It was about the kinetic energy of a shared revolution. "We stay," he said. "We finish our years. We show them that the brightest witch and the darkest heir can build something better than the ruins they left us." "I was hoping you'd say that," Hermione breathed. He leaned down, and the kiss that followed was a vow. It tasted of the cold lake air and the fierce, metallic tang of his magic. It was the DM redefined yet again. It wasn't a secret property, it was a pact. They walked back toward the castle, but the path felt different. The seesaw had finally stilled. They weren't enemies, and they weren't just lovers. They were allies. As they entered the stone corridors, the portraits whispered and the shadows shifted, but they didn't let go of each other's hands. In the common rooms, the fires were dying down. The news of Narcissa's visit wouldn't break tonight. but the shift in Draco's posture was already evident. He wasn't a boy waiting for a blow. He was a man who had been given the keys to his own kingdom. As they reached the junction where they had to part for the night, Draco pulled her back for one last lingering touch. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she promised. But as Hermione climbed the stairs to the Gryffindor dormitory, she saw a flicker of movement in the shadows near the fat lady's portrait. A tall, familiar figure was waiting for her. Harry. His face was shadowed, his arms crossed over his chest. The seesaw of her life was about to hit its most painful obstacle. The brother she had fought beside was standing in the path of the man she had chosen. "I saw you at the lake," Harry said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth she had known for 7 years. "We need to talk, Hermione. Before you do something you can't take back." The feeling of, "I need to know what's next," surged through her. The final conflict wasn't with the Malfoys or the past. It was with the present. The air in the Gryffindor corridor was stagnant, thick with the smell of old tapestries and the dying embers of the common room fire. Harry stood under the flickering light of a single torch, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the stone floor. He looked tired, not the exhaustion of a student, but the bone-weary fatigue of a soldier who had forgotten how the world looked without a front line. "I'm not doing something I'll regret, Harry," Hermione said, her voice echoing softly in the hall. She didn't move toward him, nor did she retreat. She stood her ground, the ghost of Draco's hand still warm against her palm. "You're with him," Harry said, finally looking up. His green eyes were clouded with a mixture of betrayal and genuine fear. "After everything, after the manor, after the war, you're choosing the one person who represented everything we fought to destroy." "He isn't a symbol, Harry. He's a person." Hermione's voice rose, the seesaw of her emotions tipping into a fierce, protective anger. "And if you're still fighting a war that ended a year ago, then you've already lost. We didn't fight so we could keep hating. We fought so we could have the right to choose who we love." "He won't change, Hermione. People like him they adapt. He's using you to clean his name." "He's being disowned for me," she shouted, the words slamming into the silence like a physical blow. Harry flinched. His father has stripped him of his name, his house, his future. He has nothing left but what he is, and he's still standing by me. Can you say the same for your loyalty, Harry? Does it only exist when I'm doing exactly what you expect of me? The silence that followed was suffocating. Harry looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment the warrior mask slipped. He looked like the boy who had lived in a cupboard, lonely and confused by a world that didn't make sense. "I just don't want to lose you," Harry whispered, his voice cracking. "You aren't losing me," she said, stepping forward and placing a hand on his arm. "But you have to let me grow. You have to let the world be more than just us and them." Harry stared at her hand for a long time. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. He didn't say he approved. He didn't say he understood. But he stepped aside, clearing the path to the portrait hole. "If he hurts you..." "I won't care about the law, Hermione." "I know," she said. The final days of the term passed in a blur of intense, focused energy. The atmosphere at Hogwarts had shifted from a seesaw of conflict to a state of watchful peace. The scandal of the DM artifact and the Malfoy disinheritance had become yesterday's news, replaced by the crushing pressure of the NEWTS. But the change in Draco and Hermione was permanent. They didn't hide. They studied in the library, their heads bent over the same books, their fingers occasionally brushing as they reached for ink. The final night at the castle was unusually warm. The scent of blooming jasmine and wet stone drifted through the open windows of the astronomy tower. It was here, in the place of so many tragedies, that they chose to say their farewells to the school. Draco was leaning against the stone battlement, looking out at the black lake. He was wearing a simple grey jumper and trousers, the clothes of a man, not an aristocrat. The black vault key was a heavy weight in his pocket, a promise of a future they would build on their own terms. "It feels different tonight," Draco said as Hermione joined him. The tension between them had matured into a deep, vibrating resonance. It wasn't the jagged pull of enemies, but the steady gravity of two people who had become each other's center. "The ghosts are quiet," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking about the initials," Draco said, pulling a small silver band from his pocket. It wasn't an heirloom. He had fashioned it himself from the remains of the locket's pure silver casing, purified and reforged by his own magic. Inside the band, 2 letters were engraved, DM. He took her hand, his touch light and reverent. Duo Mundi, 2 worlds. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remember everything," he said, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I remember the library. I remember the smoke. I remember the way you looked at me when you should have looked away. You gave me back my name, Hermione. Not the one my father gave me, but the one I earned." He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face. The warmth between them was absolute. The stars above seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats. "I don't know what the ministry will say tomorrow," Draco whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I don't know if the world will ever truly let us be. No ja znаю obno. But I know one thing." "What?" "I am definitely yours," he said, using her own joke with a sincerity that brought tears to her eyes. He leaned down, and the final kiss of their Hogwarts years was a masterpiece of show, don't tell. It wasn't desperate or frantic. It was a slow, deep surrender. It tasted of the future, of rain-drenched vineyards in France, of small apartments in London, of late-night debates and the quiet peace of knowing you are exactly where you belong. Hermione wound her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her heart full of a fierce, triumphant joy. They had survived the locket. They had survived the war. They had survived themselves. As they broke apart, breathless and smiling, the first light of dawn began to grey the horizon. The seesaw had stopped. The struggle was over. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "Ready," she replied. They walked down the spiral stairs for the last time. They didn't look back at the tower or the shadows. They walked through the great hall, past the empty tables and the sleeping portraits, and out through the heavy oak doors. The carriage ride to the station was quiet. They sat close, their shoulders touching, watching the castle shrink into the distance. It was no longer a fortress or a prison. It was just a school. On the platform of 9 3/4, the chaos of the returning students swirled around them. Hermione saw Harry and Ron standing near the Scarlet Engine. Ron looked away, but Harry gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Draco took her trunk, his movements steady and confident. He didn't look for his mother. He didn't look for his old friends. He looked only at the woman beside him. As the train pulled out of the station, leaving the world of their childhood behind, Hermione looked down at the silver ring on her finger. The DM caught the light, shining with a brilliance that was entirely their own. The mystery was solved. The debt was paid. The Dramione story wasn't a tragedy of rival houses. It was a story of two people who were brave enough to realize that the most powerful magic in the world isn't found in ancient artifacts or pure blood. It is found in the silence between two heartbeats, in the touch that heals a scar, and in the courage to say, "I see you." The train accelerated, carried by steam and magic toward a horizon that was finally, beautifully wide open. "Where to first?" Draco asked, his hand finding hers as they sat in the small private compartment. "Anywhere," Hermione said, leaning into him. "As long as we're together."
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than a magical locket. It is about the walls we build around our hearts. Sometimes we hate because we are afraid. We judge because we do not want to be hurt. Draco and Hermione were supposed to be enemies, but they looked past the labels. They saw the pain behind the eyes. They found that even the most broken people deserve a second chance. Love is not always easy. It can be scary, it can be loud, but it always worth the risk. I hope this story reminded you that light can grow in the darkest places. You are never too lost to be found. Thank you for listening. Keep believing in the magic of change. Until next time.